the Congress actually will be burning from stem to stern. John Randolph Tucker was a mean guy. The teaser will actually be the South's first aircraft carrier. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to learn about the 4-year lifespan of the James River Squadron, focusing a lot on ship design, availability of transposing vessels from civilian use into military use or naval use. It will all kind of end with this battle of this slide that we're looking at, which is the Battle of Trenches Reach. Now, right away, you can see the problem that really hampered Confederate ironclad construction. This is the Fredericksburg in the foreground, and basically, to float your casemate and your guns, you had to have submerged or longer ends, which would mean you had to have a longer gunboat, which also meant that to withstand the weight, to manage the guns that would be in it, you have to also have a greater draft. So when you look at ships like this, they're designed to fight in the James River, but the James River, where these ships serve, is so constricted that they cannot achieve what they need to achieve. And so that's part of our story. As you know, when the Gosport Navy Yard fell on April 21st, 1861, immediately Governor John Letcher established the Provisional Navy of Virginia on 27 April 1861. Now, right away, they go and occupy several or capture several civilian ships, especially vessels that worked for the Old Dominion line, which was a steamer line, packet line, you could say, that went from Richmond all the way up to New York City. Major purveyor of goods. The Old Dominion line actually stopped here at Old Point Comfort, believe it or not. And so so basically, under the leadership, the James River Squadron at first is commanded by a man known as French Forrest, and we'll get to see a picture of French Forrest. But while we are talking about these ships, this is the CSS Yorktown, which was renamed by the Confederates to be the CSS Patrick Henry. I have to tell you, the Patrick Henry was built by William Webb in New York. The engines were made by Morgan Iron Works. So actually, despite having the walking beam engine, this is a really great ship. It had pretty good speed. It could make 10 knots, which is a great deal during this time period. Now, this shows it partially armed, but eventually this is going to have two 10-inch shell guns, one 64-pounder shell guns, 6 8-inch shell guns, and two 32-pounder rifles. This was the most powerful ship the Confederates owned on the James River in May and April of 1861. They actually gave it an armor belt to protect the machinery. However, their armor belt, they don't understand armor yet, and so it's a 1-inch boilerplate. So that's not going to help a lot eventually. So this ship is actually, you can still see it's brigantine rig, but you never see it operating under sail. It's always a steamer. Now, the Patrick Henry is going to be joined by, there's French Forrest. And French Forrest is quite a dandy. He had been in the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. He served with distinction during the Mexican War. And when the Virginia left the Union, he resigned his commission, and he then became a captain but because of the post he held, he was named a flag officer. Back then they didn't want to name people admirals that much or commodores, so they came up with a rank called flag officer, because he can have a flag for his rank. So anyway, French Forrest is going to take over command of Gosport Navy Yard. However, his main job is to get the ships that were destroyed, raised, and for the Confederacy to do something with them. So you can't command a squadron when you're focusing on that. He's raising the Merrimack, the Plymouth, the Germantown, and all will play a role as we go through the history of Gosport Navy Yard. Nevertheless, the command of now this shows the Jamestown, which is another one. You can see it right here. Now, this is an 1862 view. Actually, this is actually something that happened on 11 April 1862. But the Jamestown is only going to be armed with two 32-pounder banded rifles and one 10-inch shell gun and six 8-inch shell guns. So it's got a different armament. It's also made by William Webb Morgan Iron Works engines. So it's fast. And actually, I'll get to it, but on April 11th, 1862, the Jamestown is going to capture 3 merchant ships under the very eyes of the Monitor, because the Virginia, of course, sorties on April 11th, and it's unable to coax the Monitor into fighting. And that's for a wide variety of reasons. Nevertheless, they have other gunboats. This is the Teaser, which used to be a tugboat serving Georgetown, Maryland, right? And the Confederates confiscate it, and they turn it into a gunboat. And let me just tell you, it's not a very powerful gunboat. It's going to have 2 guns. And I'll get to this topic in due course. So this is the commander of the James River Squadron, a man known as Commander John Randolph Tucker. See, Southerners like to have that middle name used because he's related to the Randolph family, which he is related to Thomas Jefferson. So, when he walks in a room, you're supposed to realize he's an FFV. Okay, and that's a very important thing to be. And so the James River Squadron at first will also have the CSS Beaufort and CSS Raleigh. I got to tell you, both of those are tugboats that had served the Chesapeake Albemarle Canal. The Confederates need anything they can that's got an engine. And they have to make a navy using those ships. In North Carolina, they will actually call the North Carolina Squadron the Mosquito Fleet, because they're little boats that are supposed to take on these larger Union boats. So, following the Battle of Roanoke Island and then the capture of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, the Mosquito Fleet is basically mostly destroyed. 3 ships escaped from the battle. The Beaufort, right, which is actually a pretty good vessel, and it's made by Harlan and Harlan of Wilmington, Delaware. And so it escapes through the Dismal Swamp Canal to join the James River Squadron. Following it is the Raleigh. The Raleigh is only armed with 2 6-pounder howitzers, so you can well imagine, not a dangerous ship. And the next ship to try to escape is the CSS Appomattox. And believe it or not, she's too wide to fit through the locks at the Dismal Swamp Canal, so they scuttle her there. So we see the nucleus of the James River Squadron beginning to grow, with actually 5 major ships that they will have. These ships are basically tugboats or passenger liners, merchant ships that the Confederates are converting into warships. Now, this is all pretty good. However, John Randolph Tucker is going to have to just be commander of the Patrick Henry, because in February, actually on February 17, 1862, Franklin Buchanan will be named commandant of the or flag officer of the James River Squadron. And what boat does he have? The CSS Virginia. Now, this is a major, of course, this is a Confederate ironclad. And so the James River Squadron, they have a couple little engagements before the Virginia arrives. But I'll tell you, it's like the CSS Harmony, which was assigned to Gosport Navy Yard. It shells the USS Savannah on 30 August 1861. The Patrick Henry engaged Union gunboats 13 September and 2 December 1861. But these are long-distance duels, because really the dividing line is Sewell's Point to Norfolk, then Hampton Roads, which is disputed, but the Federals control Newport News Point, which means the wooden gunboats are having to actually be posted, or their anchorage is off the mouth of the Warwick River. So as a result of that, we'll see that Franklin Buchanan, of course, will make plans to attack the Union fleet. And he actually has with him, as he comes out of Gosport Navy Yard down the Elizabeth River, he has the Raleigh and Beaufort actually supporting them. And actually the Beaufort, there's a big turn in the Elizabeth River, and the Virginia is so sluggish that they have to actually tow a line, and so they can turn the Virginia so that it can get out of the harbor. Well, this is pretty good, but the big thing is, once it enters Hampton Roads, heads to Newport News Point, and it's supported by these gunboats of the James River Squadron. So during the Battle of March 8th, 1862, we're going to see that the Confederates are going to use these gunboats as effectively as they can. Number one, they will, the Raleigh and Beaufort are there in case the Virginia gets damaged. They could perhaps tow it back to Gosport if it broke down. Remember, the Virginia had questionable engines and so forth. So those are all very important aspects to think about. When the battle goes on, actually the Virginia attacks the Cumberland. The Jamestown and Yorktown will try to fire on the Union batteries at Newport News Point. Well, the Yorktown gets a little too close, so it takes a shell through its steam drum. Remember, it's got that armor belt? Well, that armor belt doesn't work very well, and so, the steam drum explodes, and that sends steam through the vessel, and 4 men die. The Yorktown Patrick Henry will fall away, and they will actually repair the ship there during the battle and bring it back into action. That's because John Randolph Tucker was a mean guy, and he didn't like Yankees, I guess you could say. You can tell he doesn't. And so basically, during the high point of the battle, of course, the Virginia, after sinking the Cumberland, will come down and shell the Congress. And the Congress actually will be burning from stem to stern, suffers 121 killed and wounded. My gosh, this is terrible. And the ship will surrender after the death of its acting commander, Lieutenant Joseph Smith. So Buchanan goes, wow, we need to, remember Buchanan's brother is on the Congress. So they send these two gunboats, the Raleigh and the Beaufort, to go alongside the Congress, take off wounded, accept the sword. Garrett Pendergast, by that time, Arthur Pendergast, excuse me, will actually be the highest ranking officer left after the engagement. And so, William Howard Parker, who's then the actual commander of the Yorktown, will say, I need your sword. So he gives him a cutlass from the deck. He goes, no, I want your sword. In other words, his dress sword. So while that's all going on, we know that the Union troops on the shore, under the command of Brigadier General Joseph King Fenno Mansfield, a West Pointer, he hasn't surrendered, right? And so he has his men fire on the Confederate gunboats, creating several casualties. Actually, Buchanan's so mad that he sends a cutter, the one surviving cutter from the Virginia, to go over and burn the Congress because the Raleigh and Beaufort had backed away. Oh no, this can't be, because then the cutter is shot up. So the CSS Teaser, under the command of William Webb, will slip in and save the people in the cutter. And so then Catesby Jones takes over command of the Virginia and shells Buchanan tells him to plug the ship with hot shot, plug her full of hot shot till she glows. Oh my gosh. So now during I've already mentioned, but during the excursion of April 11th, 1862, the Jamestown will capture 3 ships. However, everything is running out for the Confederacy in Hampton Roads. The main problem is that the Confederates under Joseph Eggleston Johnson will retreat from the Yorktown Warwick line, which exposes Norfolk, right? Because all the Confederates are retreating back towards Richmond. So now they know they're going to have to abandon the Gosport Navy Yard. It's just a matter of when. So on May 5th, 1862, the Yorktown and the Jamestown sneak past the Federal batteries at Newport News Point, go up to Gosport Navy Yard, and they will tow the unfinished gunboat Hampton and the unfinished Ironclad, the Richmond, and they'll tow those ships back up to Richmond. Now, they also bring with them, they load those ships down with ordnance supplies, other important equipment, everything they can get out of Gosport. And so that's on May 6th when they pass by the batteries to Richmond. They come back down, but the batteries are waiting for them. And so there's trouble because, as we know, the Virginia on the early morning of 11 May 1862 will be scuttled by the Confederates, and the James River is now open to the Federals. In fact, the Jamestown will rush up to Richmond saying the Federals are in the river. And the problem is, once you get past these forts on the lower James River, you're going to need to deal with open water. Basically, there are no Confederate forts. They build the Fort Darling on top of Drury's Bluff at the last moment. They will create obstructions, and those obstructions, actually, they're so desperate, they'll sink the Jamestown. They take the guns from the Jamestown and put them up into Fort Darling, and so that stops the Union fleet from reaching Richmond. Now, I have to tell you, not much is going to happen with the James River Squadron. Actually, one ship, the Teaser, now under the command of Hunter Davison, will actually be the South's first aircraft carrier. It has their hot air balloon. Also, it's a mine layer ship. And so they actually get a little too far down the river, and at Hacksaw's Landing, they'll be attacked by the Martezan, supported by the Monitor, and the Teaser is captured. From that moment until 1864, the river is actually quiet, which is very good for the Confederates because they need to create a riverine force that can block any Union attempt to go upriver. Now, why is this important? Because the Confederates needed to have a fleet in being. In other words, if you want to bring a Monitor past Drewry's Bluff, you're going to have to mess with us. Now, as they're building, they build 3 ironclads in Richmond. One, the Virginia II, is built over at William A. Graves' shipyard in Manchester, which is across the James River from the Rocket's Landing. Rocket's Landing becomes the Confederate Richmond Navy Yard, but it's always called Rockets. And that's where the Confederates will finish the Richmond. Remember, it's towed up. It takes them, although they commission it in July 1862, it's not ready to fight until 1863. Also built there will be the CSS Fredericksburg. Now, I got to tell you, these ships, now, the Richmond and the Fredericksburg are based on designs by John Luke Porter. Now, Porter is the chief naval constructor of the Confederate Navy. However, he's using a flawed design for upriver. He has to lighten the vessel as much as possible because, at Trent's Reach, if there's a flood tide, in other words, spring flood tide, winter snow melt, what have you, it never gets above 18 feet. And these ships he's building generally have a draft of 13 to 14 feet. So that means you got to stay right in the channel. Any move out of the channel and your ship is going to be in serious trouble. Now, I got to tell you that Porter will modify his design somewhat because of his experience in building the Albemarle. That's where the diamond casemate comes into play. So that you use pivot guns, and the Albemarle only had 2, but you lessen the weight of the guns so that you don't have to have as long of a ship to stabilize the vessel. You have a smaller casemate, which means less weight putting you down in the water. This is very, very critical for the Confederates to do this. However, their problem is iron. In fact, the Richmond stays without its armor for over 6 months because Tredegar says, well, we'd love to roll you some armor plate. However, you don't have any iron to give us to turn into iron plate. So, that becomes one of the big problems. Even in Richmond, the industrial center of the Confederacy, they don't have enough iron. And so this is William Parker, and Parker is commander of the Yorktown, and they actually dock that ship at Drewry's Bluff. It becomes the Confederate Naval Academy. Now, I got to tell you, between 1862, the end of the Peninsula Campaign, all the way to spring of 1864, nothing is happening on the James River. So everyone's questioning, why are we building these ironclads? The ironclads, they cost about $250,000 gold to build. Contractors are not going to accept that Confederate money. So you're either going to have greenbacks or gold. And so this slows the process of building these ironclads, but there's no need for them. In fact, the Confederate naval personnel in the James River Squadron at Richmond will actually, more often than not, serve the river batteries and the defenses around Richmond, as R.E. Lee will go on his Maryland campaign, his Gettysburg campaign. And it's not until Grant decides to do his overland campaign that the squadron will become very active. That you can see, this is the destruction of the Virginia. I was trying to time that with the the fire alarm, but I didn't do it right. But anyway, you can see the obstructions. Now, the Confederacy in 1864. I got to tell you, let me just talk about these ironclads for a second. The Richmond's named for the city of Richmond. It has a direct acting steam engine, screw propeller. The engine system is taken from the brig Arctic and fitted into the Richmond in Gosport Navy Yard. So that ship's going to go 6 knots. Wow. It has one 7-inch Brook gun, 2 6.4-inch Brook guns, and one 10-inch Brook shell gun. Also it has a spar torpedo. The odd thing is the spar torpedoes look great on a Confederate ironclad. Trouble is, the Confederate ironclad is not fast enough to catch up with a ship to use that spar torpedo. So it's just a like device. Beware of us. So the Fredericksburg is also built at rockets. It could only go 5 knots. It is armed with 4 guns. Now remember, we're talking about the diamond casemate principle that is going to allow us to use less guns but still have powerful armament. So I want y'all to focus way up here, because this is where the James River Squadron's going to do its last real work. Whoops. There's Drury's Bluff. Okay. Here's Trent's Reach. There. As a result of that, the Confederates go through several officers to command the James River Squadron. Actually, I would say the first commander is going to be John Randolph Tucker. He then goes down to South Carolina. He'll be replaced by French Forrest. French Forrest will then be replaced by Samuel Barron. Samuel Barron was the youngest midshipman in U.S. Navy history. He was 2 years old when he was named midshipman. It's a long story, but his father had died, and so the wife was destitute, too many children. And so to keep an income coming into the Barron family, what do? Well, Junior is now going to be a midshipman. So, nice of the Navy. He never actually serves until he's 11 years old. So, I guess they didn't fit him with a uniform. But the big thing is that basically Barron wants more active service. He goes to Europe, and then he's a real FFV, by the way. He then will be replaced by John K. Mitchell. Now, Mitchell had served in the U.S. Navy since the latter part of the War of 1812. He had served in New Orleans during Farragut's attack. He is the commander of the CSS Louisiana. He's supposed to be an expert on ironclads because of that. Let me tell you about the CSS Louisiana. It has no motive power, right? When he anchors it as a floating battery, it's not as effectively placed. So Mitchell gets captured. He comes back he gets exchanged. Now he's at Richmond. Now, the Confederates, let me just tell you, when Grant begins his overland offensive, just remember the Confederates are going to have to react to not only Grant coming down overland, crossing Germanna Ford, they also have to deal with the Army of the James, commanded by Benjamin Franklin Butler. So actually in command of the Confederate troops on the south side of Virginia, around Petersburg, happens to be Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Now, when the Union troops land, they're going to be supported by 3 monitors. And so, basically, Beauregard says, "Come help me," to Mitchell. And so Mitchell says, "Well, if the Army ever opens up the obstructions, I'll be down." Well, it just so happens that the Army did open the obstructions, and Mitchell sends downriver the Fredericksburg, followed by the Richmond. This is May 5th, 1864, excuse me. And this is really important because, you know, floating artillery is going to help stop Butler from cutting the railroad, right? Well, Butler, really, the Confederates didn't have to worry about that because Butler was so bad. You know, he got bottled up at Bermuda 100. However, Mitchell, right, sees obstructions right below there at Trench's Reach, and right beyond them what happens to be 3 monitors abreast, kind of waiting on the Confederate ships. Well, that's Mitchell, who's somewhat timid, I think I should say, will fall back to Chaffin's Bluff. And that's where the Confederate fleet will remain. They will help shell Union advances, especially at Bermuda 100. One of the big problems is that when they're most needed, when Grant puts that pontoon bridge across the James on June 10th, 1864, the Confederate Navy's napping. They're not able, they could have blown up the pontoon bridge. They might have run into the monitors, but the big thing is not to allow Grant's army to cross. They do nothing, right? And so on September 29, 1864, actually the Fredericksburg and the Richmond will support the Confederate defenses of what's known as Newmarket Heights. This is called the Battle of Fort Harrison. So the Confederates will shell reinforcements coming to the Union. However, they only play a minor role in the battle. So here's this fleet worth, gosh, almost $1 million, is really not proving to be effective. So as Grant settles into the siege of Petersburg, everyone says, hey, what are you going to do? You know, Grant can be defeated because he has that supply depot at City Point, and you should go down there and destroy the supply depot. Grant will have to retreat. Richmond will be even greater safety if you do that. Well, Mitchell hums and haws, you know, the Union obstructions are too great, and so all the monitors are too much. Well, what happens is all the monitors, all the ironclads, except for the Onondaga, which is a twin turreted monitor, will be left in the James River. All the rest go for the campaign against Fort Fisher. So we're going to see this is the time to strike. Well, the big problem is the obstructions. Well, they have a extreme flood tide in mid-January, and that flood tide, you know, breaks open the Union obstructions at Trench's Reach. The Confederates know, oh my goodness, the Union have one ironclad. We've got three. We might have a chance. Now, I got to tell you, everybody knows by this time in the Civil War that a monitor with 15-inch guns, Onondaga has what? 4 of them. Death knell for a Confederate ironclad. You know, you got to realize, like the Richmond has 4 inches of iron plate on its casemate. Will that stop a 15-inch gun? The answer is no. So they have to realize that they'll have to sacrifice part of their squadron to be able to attack City Point or to try to destroy the Onondaga. You know, we know this is true from the sinking of the or capture of the Atlanta, capture of the Tennessee. So nevertheless, Mitchell agrees to have this excursion. So on 23 January 1865, the ships will come down the river. And basically, the Fredericksburg, which supposedly has the best engines, and actually I don't think you'll find a Confederate ironclad with the best engines. Nevertheless, they will, the Fredericksburg on the early morning, just after midnight, on the 24th of January, they'll slip through the obstructions. They are clear. They go beyond them. And here comes the CSS Virginia II. And the Virginia II is going to be lashed to the gunboat Drury and is going to be supported by the torpedo boat, the Scorpion. So as they come down at night, guess what? They run aground. Its supporting ship, the Richmond, runs aground. The channel is not very wide here, and so you can, oh, there's the Richmond. See, one of the problems is, yeah, it's got sloped armor, but it's got that flat forward armor, which a 15-inch gun loves to hit. And so this looks like it's going fast, but it's not. So basically, the Richmond will run aground. The Virginia II will run aground. Now, right above Trench's Reach is a place called Fort Brady. And Fort Brady, you can go there if you want to, as part of the Richmond battlefields, and you can stand in the very earthworks where the Federals have several heavy guns. And basically, this is the Confederate fleet going through the obstructions at Trench's Reach. That's not a good view of the Richmond. So basically, this is the design of the CSS Texas, which is trying to make these Confederate ironclads with lesser draft and greater armor. So this ship never gets commissioned, but it's supposed to have 6 inches of armor on its sides, 8 inches of armor in the front of the casemate. Well, that it may have a chance, but that ship is not even in the water. These are the Union obstructions at um, Trench's Reach. And look at that right there. Look at the depth of the water, right? And so this is, you can see on this map, too bad Grant didn't have I-95 or McClellan I-64, but I just want you to understand how the Union Army comes around and is moving against what we see as Petersburg, which is right, I can't get this straight. I haven't been drinking this morning. That's what this old city manager of Newport News, Ed Maroney, was in a car wreck in the morning, and when he got out of his car, it was reported that he said, I haven't been drinking this morning yet, and so that got him just a little awareness problem. And anyway, the big thing is this is Fort Brady. What are you looking at here? Well, right in front of us is a 100-pounder Parrott gun. Thinking about it, right below that gun position is where the Virginia II and the Richmond are run aground. The Fredericksburg is past the obstructions, and they can do nothing. Actually, they have at Fort Brady, this Onondaga, right? The big complaint that monitors didn't have enough firepower. Well, that's why they have 2 turrets. It really didn't solve the problem that much. But this is commanded by William Parker, Commander William Parker. And when the Confederate ships, when the Fredericksburg crosses and the Virginia II and Richmond fall, go aground, then this is a huge issue. This is the wreck of the gunboat Drury, because when it's sitting there, like the Federals are they use what is called a Drummond light. This is part of the Virginia II. Look at that smokestack. This is a Drummond light that sent this great beam, reflected beam, down into the water. So when you run aground at night, you're still not safe. And so that's why both the Confederate ironclads, in fact, one crew member of the Richmond said, I cannot count how many times we were hit, because we were hit every other second. And it wasn't that bad, but you can look at the indentations in the ships. And but basically what happens is that Mitchell will bring back the Fredericksburg, and the Virginia gets off the mud banks, so does the Richmond. And so Mitchell, under so much pressure from Mallory, Stephen Russell Mallory, Secretary of the Navy, Jefferson Davis, that he wants to make another try. Well, he gets the Fredericksburg past the obstructions. The Onondaga will come up, fire 7 shots, which hit the pilot house of the Virginia II, knocking that apart. And then the Onondaga goes back downriver. The Confederates have a chance. However, Mitchell is not willing to risk his ironclads. They're already so badly damaged, he's not sure that they can withstand any more bombardment. So on the 26th of January, they will retreat. Mitchell is fired, of course. Raphael Semmes then takes command of the Richmond Squadron, and the James Rear Squadron. There's not much he can do. Right? The ships are being repaired. He has really one vessel active. That's the Fredericksburg. And of course, when Lee abandons his defenses at Petersburg, Richmond has to fall on the evening of April 3rd, 1865. They will scuttle the Confederate fleet. Now, this does not mean that the Confederates have surrendered. So what happens is John Randolph Tucker and Raphael Semmes takes these sailors and they turn them into infantry brigades. And Semmes goes down to join up with Joe Johnson, whereas Tucker's brigade, naval brigade, will go to join with Lee's army. And the naval brigade is captured almost totally at the Battle of Sailor's Creek on April 6, 1865. Now, I got to tell you, Semmes' battalion has $500,000 in gold, the Confederate treasury. They go down towards Greensboro, North Carolina, and then they realize the futility of it all. So actually, everyone in the brigade gets $40 in gold and says, make your way home. You know, we are done. And, but, you know, there are only 1,000 of them, so that doesn't account for all 500,000. That's kind of a mystery, but nevertheless, the James River Squadron, as a fleet in being, did exactly what it was supposed to do. Monitors wouldn't try to challenge the Confederate position at Drury's Bluff because of this fleet in being. How powerful those Confederate ironclads were basically unknown to the Federals, because until June of 1863, there was no combat between a monitor and an ironclad. And when that happens, the Atlanta is defeated by the USS Weehawken. Wow, with 5 shots. So was that fleet in being that dangerous? But it did keep the Union out of the river, out of Richmond. And so it served its purpose as the guardian of the James River. It served its purpose in supporting Confederate naval activity in Hampton Roads, as well as supporting the retreat of the Confederates from the peninsula and Norfolk. They stopped the Union fleet. Those are naval gunners up atop Drury's Bluff. But from that point forward, they do not have the real great opportunities to be successful. None of these squadrons the Confederates have at Savannah, Charleston, even Mobile Bay are not able to be as effective because of their inherent problems in the ship designs. And so that is going to be cause the death knell of the Confederate Navy outside of Richmond. Thank you all very much for your support for the Mariners Museum, and I appreciate your time today.